All right, so we are going to work on this still life. Um, and the first thing I'm going to do is think about where my, oh, let's fix that light there. Um, where everything is going to be. What's my layout on this paper? Okay, so I want to make sure that I get everything that I want on there. And also, if I fill it up really well, I should make my life a little bit easier too. So I've got that book, I've got the stapler, and again, I'm just sort of blocking out where about things should be. Not doing any massive measuring just yet. I think that gnome is just a little bit further off this way, and we'll let that go right off the page. I don't need everything, right? It's perfectly fine if things um, go off the page. Remember, the rule is that if it's in my viewable area, it has to be there, but that doesn't mean that I can't make my viewable area a little bit smaller. So there's the other book on top of that. And then I've got the Rubik's Cube on top of that. And I gave that, made that a little bit more interesting. So all these things are sort of at different angles. I think I'll post, um, along with this, stuff that I'm giving to Upper L on um, the how to do 2 point perspective, because that will, just as a refresher, I think most of you have had that with me in the past, but maybe as a refresher as to how we kind of look um, at least squares. Okay, yeah, that looks pretty good. That'll go off the top there. Awesome. And then the hardest part is going to be the glass in the back. And now that I have the basic idea of how high up everything else is, I know that glass is going to go straight off my page. Great. All right, this part here is going to be the most difficult part to deal with because, well, these we call kissing um, spaces, right? So the book is just there's like no space between the book and the glass, but there's no not overlapping either, at least from my point of view here. So that's tricky, but I will deal with it. All right. So again, I'm just looking at the basic shapes. So I'm looking at that stapler thing, right? And this sort of looks like a triangular space, so it becomes a triangle. Don't overcomplicate things. If you can simplify them a little bit at this point, you do that. And I'm just kind of laying in where I see things, paying close attention to where angles are. So you can use your pencil when you're looking at things to look at what angle does that become. I can look at it and put my angle down there and check that out. There's this guy down here. All right, that looks pretty bad, but we'll go with it anyway. These angles are all off. This should be more like that. Okay. Now that I've got all the, well, Gnome's not quite in there. Let's put his head on. And again, most of this is pretty much just roughing things in. I'm not going to go into any massive detail yet. With all things in drawing, you always want to make sure that your details are the last thing that go in, because once you put details in, you're pretty much committing yourself to saying, oh yeah, that's right. I know where that is, and that's in the right spot. Right now, I'm not entirely sure. Like, I could go in and erase a lot of this, finding out that it's not in the right spot. I'm going to look at that his shoulder there. That looks like it's more straight down. All right. I think that's looking all right. The basic proportions seem okay. So we're going to move into some other things. Now that I've got all those basic things down, what I really want to look at is where are my darks and lights and work out just in shadow. I'm really not going to pay attention to really think about, like, does that look like the right shape? At this point, I'm sort of committing to this, what I've got shape-wise. And looking at ideas of negative space versus positive space and looking at where lights and darks are, that's really your best bet for drawing something and making it look like what you see, and again, not what you think it looks like. So I'm going to start, I think, here, because this is sort of the most interesting parts. I'm going to see this shape here, right, is a little bit darker. Great. This is dark. I'm going to start shading that in. Again, I'm starting with this one mostly because it's hard to define these shapes, right? Wherever you can work with shapes that are harder to define rather than easier to define. When you're sort of the left brain, we talk about that sort of idea of left brain, right brain, and your left brain wants shapes it can define. It wants stapler. I know a stapler looks like this thing that I have in my head. This thing that I have here doesn't look like a stapler at all. It looks like I don't know what. And so it's harder for my mind to grasp that, and it says, hey, right brain, what sort of spatial reasoning can you give to this? And then your right brain, that spatial reasoning part takes over, and it goes, oh, well, I can look at these different shapes here and sort of work with them. That's going to allow you to actually be able to see more true of what is there, and instead of guessing or having your left brain say, oh, that is this thing, and that thing looks in this shape. Now, I'm going really fast here, A, so that this video doesn't last forever, and B, because I don't want this to be too intimidating, quite honestly. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Now, so again, we're looking at lights and darks here mostly. This here is very dark. We'll probably have to come back to that. Alright. Stapler has this is a reflected surface. That white side of the stapler is reflecting the black of the book. That's right there, because that's black. And so that's reflecting this color back at it. So things that people really asked for, let's start to look at some of those. Number one, the pages of the book. All right, so I'm going to focus mostly on the book cover and leave those pages alone. One of the things that I think is really important in drawing is that you do not actually have to draw everything you see. A big portion of drawing comes down to, sort of like jazz, the spaces in between the notes, right? So you guys have, I'm sure, heard that from Mr. Meisch. In music, this space in between, once I define these darker spots above and below here, that space in between gets defined. All right, there's a little bit of a curve in there. I don't actually want that drawn there. I just wanted to figure out where that is. So I'm going to put in the shadow next to it, which is dark. And again, that defines the space that I haven't shadowed. There'll be another video on talking about directly about this sort of idea of drawing the negative spaces and letting the positive spaces become their thing. But that's what's happening here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in shadow here. Because as you can see in the photograph I've attached, this part here has a little bit of shadow. And I'll just kind of really lightly put that in. That area there is going to have our shadow. And there's a little bit here. And all I'm going to do is all the shadow I'm going to put in is going to be put in the direction of the pages. So I'm not drawing all the pages. I don't care how many pages are in there. I don't care if I have like, you know, 1/10 of the number of pages that are actually showing up. We're getting the idea of pages, right? Think about art, even in realism, it's all sort of a magic trick, right? It's illusion. So you are tricking your brain into thinking it is seeing what's not really there, right? So I'm not putting in any of these things. In no time here am I really drawing a book. I'm putting in the shadows and the shades that would make up that book, right? So I'm putting in this shadow of the book that's above it. And again, it's not exact, but it's going to define that triangular shape that I want to be shown above there. I generally like to work from the darkest places to the lightest places because I can always make the darkest places darker, right? It's really difficult if I make something too dark to go back and make it lighter. Even with an eraser, that gets really tricky because the paper doesn't want to give up that graphite that's now stuck to it. So that's an issue. You also notice I'm holding the pencil way back when I'm doing that. I'm trying not to press too hard. I want to be able to just add layers. Now for this demo, you notice I'm just using a standard, really crummy number 2 pencil. This is just printer paper. This is nothing special in terms of materials here. Obviously, if you have better materials, things work out better. All right, so now I'm seeing something here. I get it up to this area here, and in my still life, Noam Chomsky's head here is actually way up here. So, great thing I didn't put all that detail in yet, right? I'm noticing that he's actually here. This whole thing I drew way too small. So I have no problem now going back and redoing that. I haven't put anything into that makes me, attached to it, right? So again, this is why we leave all the details to the end. We want to make sure that we don't get attached to those details. None of this is precious, right? If something's wrong, erase it. As you come to it, go, nope, that's not right. I have no problem erasing that because, see, none of what I had drawn there is left. It's a brand new doll now, little finger puppet. So, great. So now that the shape and the size are right, I can go back and fix that up. And again, I'm focusing on where are my lights and darks. I'm not going to count how many little V stitches are in that sweater. It's not important. But basically ideas of the lights and darks in there, those are my important parts. All right, so I want to show, I put this in here because I wanted a soft object to show the difference between a hard object like we have with the stapler and this really soft object here in the doll, the little finger puppet. So I'm not going to focus on the eyes right now. I'm going to look at the sweater here and get that texture. How do I get texture of the sweater from pencil? So we take what we know about the structure of knitting. And again, you've all done some amount of this work in school. So I started with the weft, and then I work on just little hatch marks for the warp. I probably have those words backwards. I always get confused. And now I'm getting a texture that I'm looking for, right? Notice that this part right here on the arm is a little bit lighter. This part down here is a little bit darker. So I'm going to focus my drawing on the darker parts and let the lighter parts remain lighter. And again, light strokes over and over again, and I get this texture that I'm looking for. Okay? All right. Now, I would normally go and work more of this for a bit, and in terms of and getting this dark, that really should all be there by now. I'm going to jump to the glass because that was something that people wanted to see. So let's look at that. I'm just going to quickly put the shadow in here, since that's also a fabric texture. That's a woven texture too, so I'm going to just add a little bit of that. This is called cross hatching. It's just a bunch of lines, right? And then I go and put lines the other direction. And the more and more I do of those, and I can put them in a third direction and a fourth direction, it gets darker and darker. Okay. That's a really dark shadow right here, so I want to make sure that's there. All right, cool. So let's look at this glass. I have water that is, from my perspective here, sort of in this area. A couple things you're going to notice is the background color is going to be in two different spots. I may be making this glass a little bit too small, but if I don't, you're not going to see what I'm trying to point out here. So this here would be where that white sheet is. It's up here in the background, right? But through the water, it comes down here. And that's an important, all right, that's an important piece. To understand this difference here. Same thing is going to happen now. So this is going to be darker, and then the darkness is up here, up on the background. I'm not going to worry about the lettering on the side there. I sort of block out where it is. I'll come back to it later if I get to it. And I've got this thing on the glass. So I've got this printing. again, why I chose this, we've got a lot of things going on with this piece, so that allows us to talk about a few things. So this part here is mostly dark. And you notice if I can, I switch over and hold my pencil like that. That allows me to just use the very, very tip and the side to do some quick shading. Alright, that part I know is going to be dark. So I'm going to leave that dark so I can look at that and show you about how that looks. Alright, that's that part there. I'm not going to see that. Okay. Now, I want you to look at how there's this sort of light spot here. And then there's sort of this darkness here. And then there's this sort of other lightness here, which is probably the printing on the other side. And this part here is a light source hitting the water. This part here is the background showing through. So this color here is going to be very similar to this color up here, or in shades at this point that we're talking about. Okay, and I'm also looking at the other highlights. So I've got a highlight here. I've got a highlight. You're not going to see that's up here. A highlight here. So they'll be there, and the rest of this is going to be dark. Now, I picked this location because it gives me this challenge of this texture through the glass, which is really tricky. And I wanted to make sure that's there to kind of, so I can talk about it with you. All right. So I've got these sort of wavy, sort of texture-y pieces here, and I'm just going to approximate them. The thing about this is, no one else is ever going to see this, right? The original thing that you are drawing. So there is room to take a little bit of poetic license here and there. You go like, that's, you know, these wavy lines are going to look different if I look from this angle, or if I look just slightly differently, that changes what those look like. So I don't have to be super exact with them, but they should be believable, right? They should be true in sort of a fictional sense. So they don't have to be factually true as long as they make sense in that sort of believability. So I'm adding just a little bit of darkness here, and notice as I'm doing that, I'm making sure I go around because I want that to look like it's part of the glass. Seeing a highlight right here, so I'm just going to erase that into it. And I'm going to look at these lines back here again. And I'm just putting in where I see the stitching of that fabric. All right. It's a little bit darker on this side. And a little bit darker right here. And the rest is part of that highlight, right? Which is why those other parts look a little bit lighter. So I'm just going to put in a little bit of darkness. And again, look at the way the glass makes it look. The water is helping to bend the light this way. The glass, I'm seeing the back end of it more as part of my, the way it's bending in the back, right? So again, I've done this nice and light. I can go in and very easily pick out the highlights. All right, so now that I've got that basic idea, I'm going to start putting another layer in, right? Darkening in my stitches that I want to make sure you can see before I go in and laying in another bit of shading over top. You can use your finger a little bit. You don't want to do like a ton of smudging because that can get really messy looking. But on stuff like glass, it gets really, really helpful to get rid of some of those lines. And again, I go over it again with my eraser to pick out those highlights. And I'll go over that again at the end too. Beginning, it's the thing about glass that works in drawing is the contrast between those lights and darks, right? So picking out those highlights on the glass will give you that sort of reflected look that you're looking for. Noticing this little bit right here, I think, I'm not entirely sure, I think that's sort of the reflective light redoubling on itself. And that's what I'm seeing there. Okay, so let's go and make this a little bit darker too. And again, I'm using that curve. And always feel free to turn that paper to make it easier, right? So your hand is going to allow you to make a certain curve. Oh, this isn't down here. I just realized that. I should continue to here. Your hand's going to allow you to make a certain curve, and that's going to be consistent pretty much forever. And everyone's going to be, you know, that's your hand's curve, right? Just adding a little more darkness here because I'm noticing that's not dark enough. I want contrast between the things to be able to understand what I'm looking at. Really, that's what all drawing is in terms of black and white, is these different levels of contrast, right? And you're looking at those, and that's telling your mind what you're looking at. Otherwise, you don't know. Yeah, that's definitely the wrong shape of that glass, but otherwise it won't fit on the paper, and I wouldn't be able to show you the things I showed you. So I'm going to deal with it. Okay. Let's see about speeding this thing up as I go along. Just gonna quickly block those out. I know about how far apart they should be because of basic perspective ideas, so I'm not even going to look that much. So I can use texture in place of color as well. And I'm going to use that here. Some of these colors are the same shade. Like the red and the orange are almost the exact same shade. The green and the blue are really similar shades. So it's the blue's a little bit darker. Anyway, I can use that sort of texture as a way to differentiate between different colors that may be of a similar shade. And feel free to go like over, if you've got like a darker color and you're putting a lighter one on top, shoot, you can just go right over that because that's not going to show up. Again, this is why I do the light colors first. Or sorry, backwards. That's why I do the dark colors first, because what are you going to do? Make it a little bit darker? Fine. It's a little bit squished. I'm going to try to let it not let it bother me. If I was looking for a, I have to admit, if I were doing this for an important piece, this would bother the heck out of me. Oh, look what I just did. I just realized why it's squished. Because I've got 3 rows when I should only have 2. Ah! Alright. So, how do we fix that? Now it's squished the other way. Alright, that'll do for now. I'm sure a lot of you are going to ask now, what about all the words that are up on this? I've got a Good Omens book here. I've got choices here, right? I can decide whether or not I feel like that is important enough to transfer. I could decide that I go, you know what? I just don't want to. And maybe then I just put basic shapes in. So I'll kind of go over both ways to do that. I'm going to first, either way, I would do a little bit of a layout for where those letters are. And I'll put in hints of those letters here. Only because that title is pretty simple. There's not a lot of letters to it. So I've got where my letters go. And for you guys, honestly, I would probably not. I would probably not put those letters in. I'd kind of give it the idea of them without going crazy and putting them all in. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is that the this is basically working in perspective, and writing in perspective, freehand like this, it's not easy. So I'm going to just put in shadow instead of, there's some dirt on that book. Instead of writing the letters, I'm just going to shade them in. Like, where is the shadow for them instead? Ooh, went too far. Oh well. That's where it is now. And again, I'm just going to look at it in terms of shadow, and if they're legible at the end, great. If they're not, also fine. The O's will probably be super legible, right? Because they're pretty simple shape. Notice there's a little bit of a crease in that book, so I'm going to use it. I'm much more interested in the sort of the textures of this than I am in the letters. And just like with the glass, if I put some shadow in these different areas and then I leave these spaces in between without being shaded, they're going to create that sort of the texture of that wrinkle in the book. I'm going to smudge that in a bit. Okay. This part's way darker. There's a little bit of darkness back here. Put that in. Again, I'm just looking at the shadows and the shading. This book's a little more yellowed, so I want to make sure that it is darker than the white of the other book, which is a much newer book. All right, we're back to Noam. Mr. Noam Chomsky, famed bad boy of linguistics. And trouble starter in the political arena. Here's sort of, I'll get into those a little bit. Again, I'm focusing on where are the darker spots. I want to work from the darker spots to the lighter spots. I can always make them darker. If I get to the lighter spots and go, oh, that other spot isn't enough contrast, just make it darker. If I start from the lighter spots and I realize I made them too dark, ooh boy, then I've got problems. The key to drawing absolutely anything, and we'll talk more about this, is really understanding shadow. So behind his head, this is way darker right here. I put in the shadow of it, and look, there's his hair. The only real lines are these guys right here, these wrinkles that they stitched into his head. There are not any natural lines anywhere in nature, only the ones that we make ourselves. In nature, everything is sort of softer, and even like sharp things don't have hard lines. We make those. All right. All the important bits and pieces are in there. Now I really need to focus on the textures that are still left from the shadows and whatnot on my kind of foreground and background. Do not forget to put those in there. They are important. They are equally important. We do tend to leave them to the end. Even I do. But they are just as important. If those are not in there, you've got things floating in space, and you don't want that. The metal we react to in a similar way as we did the glass. Looking at highlights. Ooh, that was too strong of a line. Oh well. For this drawing, I think I'm just going to ignore all those little white words on the back of this book. Maybe I'll put it in there. I don't know. I think that's enough information for the white words on the back of the book. It's fine. That book ends about here. I want to make sure that this is in fact dark enough. That is a very, very dark black for that book. So I want to make sure that that is super dark. I also want to make sure though that my lines aren't just anywhere, right? They kind of follow the shape of the book. All right. That'll do for that. And then the background again. I'm gonna get some basic shading in there. And then pick out some basic ideas of that background texture. If it's darker somewhere, make that part darker, right? Even if it doesn't make any sense to you as to why that should be darker, go ahead and make it darker, because it is. Right? There's a shadow there. You're not maybe not seeing why it's there, but there's a shadow there. Put the shadows in. Even if it has nothing to do with the still life that you were working on. These are the things that make realism like special, right? Because just like your camera, you pick out these things. Noticing this little space here is really picked out this bit of texture right above the book. The contrast is much more dramatic right there. So, just about there. Alright. This needs to be a little bit darker in terms of contrast. Right about here. There's a bit of a shadow there. Make sure that's there. Alright. I'm calling that done. There's more to do, but I could rework this for hours. But for this, in terms of a fairly quick still life, I'm calling that done. Alright. Good drawing. Make sure you can see that really well. Alright, and there we are.